My story takes place in mid-August of 1975. My father, older brother and I are making a hurried trip to my grandmother's cabin located a few miles outside of town in the backwoods of Mars Hill, North Carolina, nestled in the majestic Blue Ridge Mountains. Her home is quiet and secluded and infrequently visited and has little to none of the standard amenities and comforts that we had come to expect and enjoy. My brother and I were 4 years apart, and that was just enough for us to be at odds with one another. Normally we would be as far apart from each other as possible, but cramped in a vehicle for hours on end was torture for us both. His constant complaining only made the distance seem punishingly longer. His whining simply forced me deeper into my shell of self-preservation. Now, just in case you may be wondering as to the accuracy or mental capacity of one so young and insecure with life, please let me assure you that I was much wiser than most, and I was very capable of in-depth understanding and knowledge of everything around me. I was mentally present and always perceptive in all ways possible. The facts that you are now hearing are accurate in every detail. This should have been an enjoyable and relaxing trip because I did love my grandmother dearly. In the past we had a few brief opportunities to speak on a phone, and those conversations alone solidified my love for her. She was family, and that was all that mattered. I was very anxious to meet her for the first time, but what was to occur in the last night of our stay was so life and mind-altering and unsettling that I was never able to share the events until now, and as for my grandmother's home, I never returned. Even to this day I become chilled and nauseous remembering what I am about to share with you now. Back to my story. After what seemed like days, we finally reached the last stretch of paved road to our destination. From what little I could see outside my window, this didn't even look like a road at all, more like a dirt track. We reached the point where we could drive no further, and we were forced to leave the comforts of the vehicle and walk the equivalent of a block or so to my grandmother's house. As a side note, I should say that my grandmother did not like the title of grand or grandmother, a title which she so lovingly had earned, but much preferred being called by her name, Sadie May. So in my own feeble attempt at a fraction of adolescent respect, I called her Miss Sadie. We reluctantly opened the car doors and grabbed only what we needed for the night, as my father clearly stated that the final track to Miss Sadie's house was unlevel, unpaved, wet and slick. I grabbed my pillow and nothing more, and quickly grabbed my father's hand to guide me in the dark. The ground was drenched and I was being pounded by unending cold raindrops from the low-hanging trees. I had only stepped feet from the car, and in moments my clothing was soaked through. Cold, wet and damp, I pushed on with only two consolations: my father's hand and the small flashlight he had given me to light the path for my feet. I distinctly remember him saying, "If you hear growling or hissing, just shine the light in that area for a few seconds and it should stop, but keep walking." I listened and willingly obeyed, but what was this it that he spoke of? Any light was comforting at this point, but the tiny batteries were no match for the darkness. It only penetrated a few feet ahead of me into the unnerving blackness and left the rest for my imagination. At last there was no more mud and no longer the feeling that the ground was moving beneath me. Instead, the path was covered in rocks, and I remembered my father saying that the rocks signified the fact that we were getting closer. Off in the near distance was the comforting sound of water flowing, and this sound became louder and louder as we slowly and carefully made our way towards it. 1 step, 2 step, 3 steps and 4, and we crossed over a small elevated bridge and then found ourselves in an open field. Suddenly my eyes caught a faint glimpse in the distance. It was inviting and welcoming. I saw a single flame, candle or lamp. All I knew was that it wasn't electric this far out in the hills. The light winked and beckoned me closer, and the closer I got, the more entrancing it became. Once I crossed to the other side of the bridge, a small window frame became clear, and it cradled the flame so nicely. Then curtains appeared, and then the house itself began to emerge. I was only feet away from a warm and dry environment, with walls and a roof for protection. As I dragged my tired and wet little body up the 12 creaky wooden steps, we were greeted with a loud and excited and much unexpected "Hello, son." I gasped slightly and shook to the bone. I didn't know that someone was even out there. It was my grandmother. She had apparently been sitting in the rocker just a few feet from the lamp, and her silhouette was hidden in the darkness. She beckoned us inside and quickly lit other lamps to enable her a greater view of her late-night guests. "So great to see you and the little ones," she said. She came to my brother first and said, My, how he's grown. They're both so big. I might just have to put these boys to work tomorrow in the field." Not exactly what I wanted to hear after our long journey, but her lack of humour was quickly replaced with hugs and forehead kisses for us all. She then looked at me and said something quietly to my father that didn't quite make sense. She said, "Oh, look at the little one, so darling and precious. He looks just like him, you know." All I heard was the word precious, and that made me feel special. Meeting her for the very first time was so thrilling and eye-opening. I was learning more and more about her and my father as the minutes passed. He became a child again in her presence. But this enlightening time ended quickly as we were encouraged to shed our wet garments and get into bed. I was exhausted and in need of sleep. I had no idea that this would be my last night's peaceful sleep, because these backwoods were holding a menacing secret that I would soon come face to face with. But for now, rest. In the morning, a soft light filled my room as rays of sunshine filtered through the handmade ivory-colored lace curtains. I don't remember ever having such a refreshing night's sleep before. The feathered down bed was so soft and comfortable that it consumed my body and surrounded me with pillowing hugs all night long. I opened the door for my room and there it was. It was one of the most memorable smells. I can honestly say I will never forget that. As I stepped into the parlour, I saw Miss Sadie's best dishes laid out before me. They were simple and unadorned, but placed with meticulous precision. Miss Sadie was in the kitchen cooking feverishly over her black cast iron stove. The sound and smell of freshly cooked sausage sizzling on a wood-burning stove was worth the drive here. She began by making the sausage first, and then she would drain the sausage into a side skillet and would then cook the bacon in that rendered fatty fluid. After the bacon had been removed and set aside, the remaining bacon and sausage grease was added to fresh cream and flour and made into an ever-thickening gravy. Small bits of rendered bacon and larger pieces of sausage were then added for dimension, and this made sausage gravy to die for. The gravy was the focal point of the table until her homemade biscuits entered the room. They were soft, buttery, huge and flaky and ready for consumption. You just knew they were delicious by their appearance alone. Once the food had been placed on the table, we all then took our place at the designated spot set aside for us by Miss Sadie. Miss Sadie was seated at the head and my father to her right. My brother and I were strategically separated for obvious reasons, and I couldn't be happier. Strangely though, the four of us were sitting there at the table, set and lovingly prepared for 5. An empty spot was left at the other end of the table, and in the chair seat below was placed a small stuffed animal that was tattered and torn with age. I didn't ask why and did my best to give the impression that I did not even see the toy or the table placement. I thought it strange, but I was so hungry that it just didn't matter. All I knew was that if I waited any longer, I would begin nibbling on the fake fruit that was placed in the center of the table for decoration. After our meal was done and our bellies were full, we fulfilled our responsibilities with the cleanup, and then we were free to go. But before I left, I asked Miss Sadie this one question that I couldn't get out of my mind. Miss Sadie, why was our table set for 5 people even though it was just the 4 of us, and where did that toy come from that is sitting in the chair? My father looked over at his mother, then back to me and back again to his mother and said, "It's okay, you can tell him." She walked over to me and put her arm around my shoulder and led me towards the front of the house. We walked slowly and had no words between us. We came to her bedroom and she opened the doors and we walked in. This was a room I assumed was off limits, so I felt privileged to have admittance. Once inside, I saw an old photograph on the back wall. This was an oval frame with a large dome of glass that convexed out from the front. The photograph was of a boy similar to my age and size. The very interesting thing to mention here was the resemblance between us was striking. I felt as though I was looking in a mirror. It was aged and slightly faded with dust, but very clear. This was obviously a person of importance to my grandmother. "Miss Sadie," I said, "who is this?" As her eyes began to tear up, she softly said, "This is my son. His name was Tommy, and he was your dad's baby brother." There was a stillness in the air. I asked her where Tommy was now, and she said that he had passed away and was buried at the top of the hill above the house in the family graveyard. I should have just left my questions there, but I had to know more, and now, after the fact, I realize I should have just given up my investigation. What happened to him? She told me the story that he was my age when he passed away. He had become sick at a very young age and that he had died unexpectedly, but that she was ready to let him go because she was given a sign of what was to come. Apparently Tommy's room was the room I was sleeping in, and the bed I slept in was also Tommy's. She went on to say that on the morning that he passed, he was lying in bed with a fever and that she had all the windows and doors open to allow the air to cool him and keep him comfortable. It wasn't until she opened the front screen door to allow a better breeze in the house that something very strange occurred. As she opened the screen door, a large screech owl flew in and perched itself on the bedpost at the foot of Tommy's bed. She said that when she went to get the broom to chase the owl out of Tommy's room, there was Tommy with his eyes fully opened. He was looking at the bird, and then without reason the bird released a piercing squeal and quickly flew out the front door. Miss Sadie did not hesitate to close the front door and then came back to Tommy's bedside, but he had already passed over. She said and confirmed this was an omen and that the bird took his last breath. I can't describe how I felt at this moment. For the first time in my life I had no words, no thoughts. I was filled with emotion, sadness and horror. I said nothing. Tommy passed in the bed you rested in, and that was his chair at the table. I always set a place for him, and I can still feel his presence with me. I truly feel as though she thought I was his reincarnation. I never went back into her room again, and I never looked at his image again, but it stays burned in my memory still. Most of the time there was spent on the porch out front, listening to the birds and the creek that ran parallel to the porch about 40 feet away. I had no difficulty finding things to amuse me. There were places to discover, rocks to turn over, and many ways for me to just disappear. Looking off the porch directly in front of me was the creek which ran from left to right as far as I could see. To my right was a large cornfield with the old run-down outhouse located directly in front for all to see. I hated that thing. It was dark and dismal and reeked of truly awful odors. I knew the time would come when I would be forced to use it, but till that time I would hold everything in as long as possible. To the left of the porch was a much larger field. This was a tobacco field, and on the side was a large 2-story shed with tobacco hanging inside. This belonged to Miss Sadie's neighbour in the house on the hill behind it. This shed had seen better days, and it gave the impression that it would topple over with just a few strong winds. It was nice to leave my family behind and go investigating alone. I guess there was no concern or danger, as they willingly let me go wherever I wanted for as long as I wanted. My instructions were only not to go over the bridge and not to go up the hill behind the house for any reason. As my explorations continued in this new territory, I glimpsed a house above the tobacco field, and there was Zelda, my grandmother's neighbour, sitting on her front porch. Her home was similar to Miss Sadie's in that it was elevated a good 4 to 6 feet above the ground. When our eyes met, she stood up and waved. She seemed really friendly. Zelda was a short woman with shoulder-length grey hair, no teeth, but a huge smile. Even without teeth, I have to admit that her smile was more beautiful than any smile I can remember. I could tell already that this visit would be a highlight of my day. In your heart you knew she didn't get many visitors anyway, so this gave me a great sense of worth. Even her 3-legged cat came up to love on me a little. We sat and talked and laughed and ate these cookies that she had made from the berries that were gathered on the hill behind my grandmother's house. "Where are these berries?" I said, as I put them in my mouth. She told me that these berries were plenteous on the hillside about halfway up, but didn't hesitate to remind me not to go up there under any circumstances, but if my father went up there with me, it might be okay. Before I left, she murmured, "Don't you forget Zelda now, okay, little one?" Yes, ma'am, never. Time passed by so quickly, and I hated to leave, but I knew that I should head back to the house before someone began to look for me. I knew that I still had some time though, and since I had an empty bowl, why shouldn't I get some berries for Miss Sadie? Wouldn't that be a great surprise? I quietly sneaked up to the hill. I didn't want to get in trouble, but I also wanted to surprise Miss Sadie with the berries because I knew she could never climb this hill and get them herself. The hill was steep and covered with lots of rocks and briars and the occasional swarm of gnats. I eventually got so high that it was frightfully unsettling for me to stand up fully. I stayed on my hands and feet and didn't look down. Finally, I came upon a huge patch of wild berries, some black and others red. I knew these were the ones because they resembled those I had tasted at Zelda's. I grabbed a cluster here and there, and before you knew it, my bowl was overflowing with sugary goodness. From this vantage point, I could see Zelda and Miss Sadie's house and the adjacent fields. I felt like a king over my domain. They all looked so small from up here. I stood there confident and poised and closed my eyes. The sun on my face felt amazing. Then everything stopped. And I mean suddenly stopped. No birds and no wind. A chill came over me, and for whatever reason I decided to look behind me. I could see some of the gravestones and didn't realize that I was this close to the top. I knew that I should go down now, but I wanted to visit my namesake's grave and felt it was only right that I should visit Tommy. I didn't think it would hurt to pay some respect to a family member's grave that I had so much in common with. I decided to go to the top anyway, and even though I was disobeying orders, I just had to do this. The graveyard was small and surrounded by a fence of stacked stones. One after the other, the stones made a large square around the barrier of the graves. I had come this far, so why not step over? The grave markers were modest and simple and carved with unprofessional tools. Someone had obviously put a lot of love into these memorials. I would say that there were no more than 15 to 20 graves present, and there in the middle was Tommy's gravestone. It was pristine and well kept, void of overgrowth and well cared for. I say all this because I need to point out that the other graves in the family cemetery were broken, thrown about or vandalized. Some graves were missing headstones and some of the graves had been opened as well. You could literally see the caskets beneath the cracked stones. I just couldn't figure out who would do such a thing or why, but at least Tommy's was undisturbed. There was one thing that I did find disturbing about Tommy's plot. There were 2 dead squirrels placed behind his headstone. They looked as if they had just crawled there and went to sleep and died. Don't ask me why, but they looked peaceful to me. Maybe Tommy liked squirrels and someone placed them there to remember him. I had the feeling I should do something similar. Without a thought, I took 5 of the largest and plumpest black berries that I had inside my bowl and placed them directly on the letter O in Tommy's name. I made a circle to match the shape of that letter on the flat gravestone. I then chose a big red berry for the center to signify love and remembrance. It looked pretty and I was pleased with my efforts. I knew that birds would no doubt eat my offering, but I wanted to show an act of kindness. When I began to walk away, I heard what today I can only recall as a slight sigh or growl, but it petrified me nonetheless. I walked away quickly and didn't look back because if something was watching me, I didn't want to know. I certainly made it down the hill much faster than I had climbed it, and unfortunately lost a few berries along the way, but I made it down safely. I still don't know why I was so scared, or why my family insisted upon me avoiding something as simple as a graveyard. It was only a matter of time before I found out why, when I went back inside the house and placed my offering of goodness on the center of the table and waited for Miss Sadie to find them, and find them she did. I was hoping for more of a surprise or cry of happiness, but instead she cried out to my father using his first and middle name, and I'd never heard that before. "James Carter, come here quickly and bring the little one." She put her hands on my shoulders and looked at me sternly and said, "Where did you get these? Where? Tell me now and be truthful with me." My dad just looked on in fear. I began by telling her that I went to visit Zelda and that she gave me this bowl, and that was as far as I got in my explanation before she sat down and let out a sigh of relief. "Oh, you got these from Zelda? Okay, sorry sweetie, I just wanted to make sure you didn't go up that darn hill." I couldn't tell her. Her reaction alone told me I'd made the right decision. The day had come to a close and our last meal had ended. The morning would soon come and we would be off on our way again. At least this time we would travel in daylight, and that calmed my nerves. We sat and talked about school and the coming holidays and anything else that crossed our minds. I don't know how time flew by so quickly, but it did, and the long day's activities and the solid meal we had just consumed just weighed me down. I was beginning to yawn, and the weights of my eyelids were beginning to win the fight. We have come to the last night of our visit, and this is the night that remains with me to this day. It is the most gut-wrenching night from my past. This experience startled me in many ways, and what I have to share with you is completely accurate and without dramatization or fabrication. I don't feel that anything else is needed here other than the truth. The truth is far more bizarre than anything I could create on my own. I enjoyed the previous night's rest, so there was no reason why this one shouldn't be equally as restful. I lay there drowsy and sleepy-eyed. I fell asleep quickly and was in a dead sleep for quite a few hours, until the sound of what seemed like footsteps walking across the bridge over the creek woke me from my slumber. This bridge was built by my father's eldest brother years and years ago. It was strong and sturdy, and it quickly announced to you if anything or anyone was walking across it. I know that I heard feet walking across the bridge this night. I initially tried to look out my window, but it was far too dark to see the bridge. I lay back down again and told myself that I was just hearing things, and that my mind was just playing tricks with me. After all, I was the only one awake, or so I thought. I was wrong. I was very wrong. Within moments after I heard the feet walking over the bridge, I then heard something rustling through the grass, and my entire body began to shake. There was something out there, and it was coming towards the house. My father lay across the room from me, snoring peacefully and unaware of the stress I was under. I was uncontrollably shaking and wanted to cry out, but didn't, for fear of drawing attention to myself. So I remained still and silent. Then the night turned into a full-blown nightmare as the sounds of feet rushing through the grass dissipated into large, heavy breathing cycles. Large, drawn-out inhales followed by extended, breathy exhales filled the air and consumed everything around it. A very distinct and unforgettable odor accompanied this visitor, and I am likely never to forget that smell. I was sure of it. There was something outside my window now, and it was breathing and looking in and watching. Part of me just kept my face covered with my sheet, and yet I was still so very curious to see what this was. As far as my safety inside the house was concerned, I knew there was nothing to be worried about because the entire house is a good 4 to 6 feet off the ground, and my window is another 2 feet up from there. My mind must be playing tricks on me. So, if all this was only in my mind and there was actually nothing to be afraid of, then it wouldn't hurt for me to take a glance out the window and verify what was not happening. My adolescent curiosity got the best of me, and it forced me to do something that I now as an adult regret having done. I lay there and silently counted to 10 backwards. And I told myself that if I still heard breathing after I got to 1, that I would get up and take a fast but thorough look out the window and end this madness, and go back to sleep. I felt for sure that this must be a deer that had gotten lost in the valley and made its way onto the property. It had to be that. This was one of the creative ideas that I constructed to help me combat the unknown. So I counted down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and as I continued to count, I would slow down my numeral descent because I knew what would happen once I got to the final number. 5, 4, 3, and with the number 3 I grabbed my little flashlight that my father had previously given me and prepared to jump up. It was conveniently kept close to me for comfort. It now lay very close to my heart, and I prepared to look into the darkness. Then, 2 and 1, the time came for me to spring into action. I grabbed the flashlight and violently threw the sheets off me, and turned to the window and placed my flashlight directly against the screen and without hesitation turned it on. What I saw was the most horrifying face that anyone could ever imagine or create. I will forever remember this image and never forget it for the rest of my life. As I turned on my flashlight, there in front of me was a large face filled with dark brown hair and the most terrifying and piercing eyes, dark as coal. When the glare from my flashlight hit the eyes of this creature, it emitted a dreadful, piercing scream. Not only did I startle the creature, but I managed to make it very angry as well. It shook the frame of the window screen with a force that woke everyone in the house. I don't know if this was an attempt to reach me or to terrify me, but then the creature quickly and without warning sliced its hand across the screen, making 4 large and very real slash marks that went from the right of the screen down to the bottom left. I ran into the living room and fell on the floor screaming and yelling and curled myself into a ball crying, "Please make it stop, please make it stop." It all happened so quickly. Soon my grandmother ran out of her bedroom with a shotgun, threw open the front door and ran off down the porch and into the yard, and stood there in the dark and began shooting and screaming, "You're not welcome here! Get out! Get out! It's not Tommy! Leave us alone!" I have no idea if she managed to hit the creature, but one thing was definite. She was aware of something and she was prepared. She spoke to it as though this was not their first encounter. I was stunned and I couldn't speak. I couldn't cry. I just sat there trembling hysterically. My father closed the window to cover the cut marks, and I was encouraged to go back to bed. "Whatever that was, son, it will not return. Get some rest." I lay there in a cold, zombie-like state. A few hours later, a cry could be heard in the distance that sounded similar to a combination of a woman giving birth and a dog being run over by a car. It was a terrifying howl, and it seemed far off and very close by at the same time. Lastly, I heard a huge thump on the side of the house, as though a large bird had just flown into it in the dark. This sound didn't seem to affect my family in any way, but I heard it and I felt it to the core of my being. The next morning after we awoke, we were all much calmer. Everyone acted as though nothing untoward had happened the previous night. But something inside me gave me the impression that my grandmother knew that the berries I had given her were in fact from the hillside and not from Zelda. As my family packed and prepared to leave, I decided to walk outside and look at the side of the house where my window was located. I felt like it was safe to go outside because it was daylight after all. I walked out the front door onto the porch and down the steps and immediately was overcome by that same stench I'd smelt the night before. The odor grew stronger as I approached the window. I finally stood there in front of the window, and there beneath it on the ground was a decapitated animal. It had been mauled and severely attacked and even partially eaten and then thrown against the side of the house. There was blood smeared everywhere. There was even blood on the screen, but I couldn't see the entire screen due to the fact of the height of the window itself. I looked up at the screen and I could see some of the claw marks across it. And then my fear intensified, because if I was able to see a face in the middle of my screen, then whatever was at my window had to have been between 8 and 10 feet tall. I then recalled its awful, chilling scream and hurried back into the house. To this day, I am uncomfortable with what I saw there on the ledge outside of the window. I am left unsure. I remember my grandmother telling me not to mess with the cemetery at the top of the hill, and I wonder if I had irritated or disturbed something up there. We left that day, and I don't remember any part of the drive on the way back. I was still traumatized. I am still unsure of what I encountered. Because of the fear of looking stupid and crazy, I never shared this story with anyone because I knew just how crazy it sounds. Now, 40 years later, I have nothing to fear. Sometimes at night I still see and smell this dreadful animal, and I remember its face peering into me and screaming and yelling and shaking the frame of the window with anger. I still see its face in my dreams. I have never gone back to that house. I never ever visited my grandmother after that time, and never again would I look up and see Zelda at the top of the hill. But I truly feel that they were aware of this creature and they knew of him. My grandmother and father and Zelda have all since passed away, and no one remains to verify my nightmare. But this is my own true story. Believe me, I wish it wasn't. Oh, and what did I find outside on the windowsill of the house? There before me lay a circle of 5 black berries with 1 red berry in the center, placed exactly how I had left it on Tommy's grave.